It was an ordinary afternoon when Pedro appeared at my door, his face pale and his eyes tired. He was so young, just 20, and life seemed to have been merciless to him. I, Lucia, at 58 years old, knew what loneliness was. My house was an echo of memories, and the silence became more and more deafening. Listening to their stories of heartbreak and pain, I felt an uncontrollable urge to help, but at the same time, an insidious idea began to creep into my mind. I offered him a shoulder to lean on, a safe place where he could open up. But what was supposed to be an act of compassion began to turn into something more. Every time he shared his insecurities, I felt more alive. It was like I was draining his energy, filling my emotional void with his vulnerability. He had no idea that by seeking comfort, he was becoming a source of validation for me. Pedro started spending more time with me. We laughed together and shared confidences, but there was a growing tension that he didn't notice. With each interaction, I found myself more involved in a game of emotional manipulation. Deep down, I knew I was crossing a dangerous line. What began as a genuine desire to help had now become a carefully woven trap. How would Pedro react when he discovered the truth about my intentions? The relationship with Pedro began to intensify. I encouraged him to share more about his life, his insecurities, and he did so with growing confidence. It was a refreshing feeling, seeing how he opened up, how his barriers were falling. But there was something dark about it all. I was feeding a selfishness that I didn't even fully recognize. Every shared laugh and every knowing look was a reminder of how I felt alive again, even if it was at the expense of his fragility. But what I didn't realize was that, little by little, Pedro began to transform. He was starting to see the patterns in our interaction. Each time he seemed insecure, I found myself tempted to manipulate him more. He needed support, but I was using it to reaffirm my own worth. The line between caring and controlling was becoming increasingly blurred. One night, as we watched a movie in my living room, the tension became palpable. He was restless, as if he had something to say. The silence was almost deafening. I knew he wanted to talk about his insecurities, but I also knew this was the moment I needed to reassert my control. With a soft smile, I touched his arm and said, "You can trust me, Pedro. I'm here to help you." His look changed. I saw a flicker of doubt, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Deep down, a part of me worried. What did he really think about me? Was he realizing the manipulation that was taking place between us? Was it time to press harder or retreat? "I don't know if I can trust you completely," he murmured, the vulnerability in his voice carrying a weight that almost knocked me over. And then, everything started to fall apart. How could I keep Pedro under control when he started to question everything? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your manipulation was being discovered? In the following days, something changed between us. Pedro was more distant, more cautious. I was no longer the same confident young man who used to seek my company as if it were the only safe haven in the world. Now, he approached with a more attentive, almost suspicious look. I knew he was starting to realize what was happening. And that scared me. The feeling of losing control was like a slowly spreading poison. When he didn't show up on a day that used to be ours, my first reaction was anger disguised as concern. What was he doing? I started to wonder if he was trying to get away from me. But at the same time, the thought of losing that source of validation made me desperate. I decided to go after him. I went to his house, and when I saw him, I could see how different he was. His posture was upright, his gaze firmer, as if he was shielding himself against something he still couldn't understand. I was received by a more closed, more mature Pedro. But also further away. "Why didn't you look for me?" I asked, trying not to sound too anxious. My voice, however, betrayed my fear. He could sense my insecurity. "I was thinking about the things you told me," Pedro replied, his voice carrying a coldness I didn't expect. "I don't know anymore if you're really helping me or if you're using my problems to fill your void." Every word was a blow, and a part of me wanted to explode, wanted to scream that he didn't understand anything. But another part, the more rational part, knew he was beginning to see the truth. He had already begun to notice the subtle manipulation I was exerting, and it made me feel unbearable pressure. "Pedro, I'm here for you," I tried to justify myself, but something in my voice didn't sound convincing, not even to myself. I knew my intentions were starting to be questioned. He no longer saw me with the same confidence. And that bothered me deeply. How dare he walk away from me when I had been everything to him? "I need some time," he said, before turning on his heel and walking into his house, leaving me alone with my thoughts. And there, on the deserted street, alone once again, reality dawned on me. I had lost control. I had manipulated a vulnerable soul, and now he was walking away, leaving me to my own frailties. In the following days, Pedro's absence consumed me in a way that I didn't know how to deal with. He avoided my calls, my messages went unanswered. The house, which had previously seemed alive when he was around, now seemed even emptier. But loneliness wasn't just my company, it was also my punishment. The manipulation had turned into a prison, and I was the prisoner. I knew Pedro was pulling away, and a part of me resented him for not being grateful for what I did for him. I couldn't understand how he could see me as the villain in this story. I was just trying to fill a void he didn't understand. I didn't understand the pain of being alone, the pain of not being needed by anyone. He had a family, he had friends, he had so many things that I no longer had. But now he was pulling away, and that was affecting me in a very profound way. That's when I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't let him walk away from me without doing something. I got ready to go to him, talk, try to get him to see things from my point of view. I knew I could convince him, that I could manipulate his emotions so that he felt guilty for pushing me away. That's how things worked. Wasn't it? I had always known how to play with words, how to make others feel small so I could feel bigger. But this time, something felt different. Something inside me was breaking, and I no longer knew if my own strategy would work. When I arrived at the door of his house, my heart was racing. Not from excitement, but from fear. Fear of losing control once and for all. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. He opened the door, and his eyes met mine, cold and distant. "What do you want, Lucia?" he asked, his voice calm but with a firmness that made me take a step back. He wasn't the desperate, vulnerable Pedro I knew. It was someone stronger, someone who was beginning to see the truth. I hesitated for a moment. What would I say? What else could I say to convince him that I was right? "I just want you to understand that I did this because I care about you," I said, my voice wavering. But upon hearing my own words, I knew they were not true. I wasn't doing anything for him. I was doing everything for myself. "You care about yourself, Lucia." "And that's the problem," Pedro replied, his words cutting through the tension in the air. "You used me. You manipulated me." And there, in front of me, was the naked truth. He knew what I did, and now he was pulling away from me irreversibly. I stood there, standing at Pedro's door, feeling the weight of his words in my chest. The air seemed to have become thicker, and the feeling that everything was slipping out of my control came over me. He didn't see me like he used to. The admiration I thought he felt for me had turned to repulsion, to disgust. I, who saw myself as the wise woman who helped others, was now being confronted with the bitter truth that I had been the cause of someone's pain. Pedro was no longer willing to be manipulated, and that left me powerless. He turned away from me, and the door closed with a muffled sound, but the echo of that closing still resonated in my mind. The silence, the same silence that used to keep me company, was now oppressive. I looked at the house, at the life I'd built on my own, and realized how empty it was. It wasn't just the house that was empty. I was empty. I was alone, more than ever. Night fell, and I sat in the armchair, my hands trembling in my lap, trying to piece together everything that had happened. The feeling of having lost Pedro was unbearable. He was the last person left for me, the last attempt to fill a void that I didn't even know how to deal with anymore. I was desperate, and I knew I had crossed an irreversible limit. That night, as he looked at the dark window, longing and regret began to mix. Had everything he had done been in vain? Or was it that, deep down, the truth was that I no longer knew who I was without someone to control? Maybe I wasn't even aware that I was manipulating Pedro. Maybe I was just trying to fill a void that could no longer be filled. What I had done to him could not be undone. The damage was done, and I only had myself to blame. However, a voice inside me whispered that perhaps it was too late to understand this. I had lost the only person who truly cared about my presence, and now there was no one left. The weight of regret consumed me with each passing hour. I knew that nothing could ever be the same again, that Pedro would never trust me in the same way again. But still, there was something in me that couldn't give up hope, something that insisted that maybe, somehow, I could make everything right. Maybe it was loneliness that pushed me to look for a way to regain his friendship, or maybe it was the fear of admitting that, finally, I was completely alone. I decided to do what I always did, try to control the situation. I knew where he spent most of his time. In a desperate impulse, I went to the cafe where Pedro used to go to have fun. My heart was beating fast, but something told me that I needed to try, even though I knew the chances of success were small. When I entered the place, my eyes quickly searched for him, but Pedro wasn't there. I sat at an empty table and ordered a coffee, trying to remain calm. The place was peaceful, but I couldn't focus on the atmosphere around me. The only thing that mattered was Pedro's absence. I remained there for more than an hour, watching people pass by, trying to understand what I had done to make him avoid me so much. What could I have done differently? Guilt gnawed at me. But my need to regain control over the situation was even stronger. I needed to show him that I still cared, that I was still willing to help him, even if it meant manipulating him again. At that moment, an idea formed in my mind. And if I could do you need me again? He had pushed me away, but I could find a way to become indispensable to him again. What if, instead of trying to fix things, I just used his vulnerability again? What made me think I couldn't manipulate the situation once again to my advantage? But at the same time, a part of me, the part that still had some semblance of conscience, asked itself, Lucia, do you really want to do this? Are you willing to continue with this, even though you know where it will end? I knew that my attempt to manipulate Pedro again was a path of no return. And yet, there I was, thinking about how I could take back control. The feeling of emptiness was something I no longer knew how to face. I, who had always been so smart, so capable of dealing with people, now found myself at the mercy of my own weaknesses. Pedro didn't answer me, and I knew he was avoiding any contact. But I couldn't just let it all go. She wasn't the type of woman who gave up easily. He needed to understand that what I did for him was what was best for both of us. And, if necessary, I would do anything to win him back. The last time I saw Pedro, he was so distant. His eyes, which had once sparkled with hope and confidence, were now cold and empty. How could I have let this happen? How could I be so insensitive? Guilt gnawed at me, but at the same time, anger was still present. Anger at myself, yes, but also anger at him. He was rejecting me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to get rid of this feeling of being despised, of being discarded. I, who had always controlled everything, now felt like I was losing control of my own life. The thought of losing Pedro scared me. He was my last hope, my last bit of company. And as the night dragged on, I knew I had to try one more time. No matter what it took. It didn't matter what price I had to pay. Pedro couldn't reject me, not like that. I wouldn't allow that to happen. I prepared myself to act, to not let the distance he had created between us be the end. The pain I felt was mixed with an urgent need to take control of the situation. He didn't know what was best for him. I knew. And she was willing to do anything to make him see that too. I knew I needed to act fast. Pedro wouldn't give another chance easily, and the idea of losing control over him made me desperate. I decided to go to his house, Maybe he would welcome me if I showed how much I cared. What I had done to him, I didn't know how to fix it, but I could try. All I wanted was to bring him back, to show that he still depended on me. The silence of that night seemed to consume me. The street was quiet, lifeless. Every step I took towards his house felt heavier than the last. The feeling that he was about to make an even bigger mistake hung in the air. But I was beyond all reason. When I reached his door, I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The ringing sound echoed, and I could almost hear my own heart pounding in my chest. He took a while to open them, but when he did, his eyes were cold, distant. "What do you want, Lucia?" His voice was serious, without any trace of empathy. That was a version of Pedro that I didn't know. He was no longer fragile. He was strong. I felt like I was facing an insurmountable wall. "I just want to talk, Pedro," I said, trying to stay calm. "I just want to explain what happened. I never wanted to hurt you." Pedro looked at me for a few seconds, as if he was evaluating my words, and then, with a sigh, he said, "You didn't hurt me, Lucia. You used me. And I can't let that go." He looked to the side, as if searching for the strength to continue. "I don't want any more of this. I don't want you controlling my life anymore." Those words cut into my soul. He was rejecting me in a way I didn't know how to handle. All the trust one had built, all the manipulations I had done, were now crumbling before me. And in that moment, I knew I had lost more than just Pedro. I had lost myself. I don't know who I am without you anymore," I said, almost whispering. The pain he felt overflowed, but it was too late to turn back. Pedro didn't say anything else. He simply closed the door slowly without any further explanation. And I stayed there, alone again, with the feeling of having finally lost control over everything. I stood at Pedro's door, feeling the cold wind hit my face as the door slowly closed. The silence that followed was as heavy as a stone. I, who had always prided myself on having control over situations, was now faced with a reality that I never imagined facing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to react. The pain I felt that night was something I had never experienced, and it was a pain so deep that it seemed to consume me from the inside. Loneliness came back to swallow me tightly, and I knew there was no going back. Everything I built, everything I did to fill the void in my life, was falling apart. And I couldn't stop it. What was left for me now? I had lost Pedro, and with him, the last chance to fill the loneliness that had accompanied me for so long. It was as if I were floating in the void, without a point of support, without a direction. I entered the house, feeling the weight of defeat accompany me in every step. The house. What once seemed like a refuge to me now seemed like a prison. Everything around me seemed to remind me of my failure. The walls, the furniture, the objects that had given me comfort for so long were now empty, meaningless. The silence in the house was deafening, and I didn't know how to deal with it anymore. I sat in the armchair, looking at his shaking hands. I knew there was nothing more to do. Pedro had moved away from me, and I couldn't force anything else. I had destroyed the only chance I had of rebuilding something. And now, what was left? An emptiness. An emptiness that somehow seemed increasingly unbearable. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the weight of guilt, but the truth was inescapable. I had destroyed everything. I knew I had manipulated Pedro, that I had taken advantage of his vulnerability, but I never imagined it could lead to this point. I never imagined he would turn away from me, that he would see me as a threat instead of a savior. And now, I was alone again. The weight of loneliness dragged on me, and I no longer knew how to deal with life. The emptiness I felt was unbearable. It wasn't just the lack of Pedro, but the emptiness of no longer knowing who I was without him. The woman who had made use of the weaknesses of others, of the experience I had gained over the years, now found herself devoid of any power. I, who had so many strategies, who thought I was so wise, was helpless, lost. The nights were even more difficult. Pedro's absence consumed me in ways I didn't know I would be able to bear. Before, I could fool myself, filling the void with small moments of control, with the feeling that I was being useful, that I was helping someone. But now the truth was stuck in my chest like a sharp knife. I had used Pedro. I had manipulated her pain to supply mine. And he knew it. The house seemed even colder, quieter. Every corner reminded me of my failure, of everything I'd done to keep him close to me. Even in my most desperate hours, I knew I could no longer resort to the same tricks. There was no one else to manipulate, no one else I could convince that I was being the person I said I was. What I was left with was the weight of regret, and it was crushing me. I tried to convince myself that everything was just a phase, that, with time, things would get better, but a voice inside me told me that there was no going back. I had destroyed the only chances I had of keeping something genuine. And there was nothing I could do to recover what was lost. Then, how could I move on? How could a woman who had already manipulated, controlled, tried everything to fill her own emotional voids, now find meaning in her life? I had no answers. I didn't know how to live without others, without the illusion of control. All I had left was the silence of my own conscience, which, cruelly, reminded me of everything I had done.